In some sense, how can one say anything without saying everything at once? In other words, if the thinker doesn't say everything that they know, then whatever they say in detail will be misunderstood. And Heidegger says that he was misunderstood. I can only try to get out as much as I can and extemporaneously, and then see what's been said and see what I can fill in. Thinking of Heidegger's book on the sophist, his lecture seminar on the sophist, he went the longest time into all kinds of details on Aristotle. The whole half of the book is about the book giving the lecture, as written down, is about Aristotle, and basically about going through all the machinations of his studies of Aristotle, which, as far as I remember, I get different year counts on this. Maybe he said the first 15 years. I thought he said the first 25 years the students should study Aristotle. But in any case, and remembering that, as it turns out, Heidegger did not study quite a few of the great major thinkers in any serious sense until he was approaching, I think he was approaching 40 or so when he really studied Kant seriously, if I remember correctly. But in any case, you can see that Heidegger made an attempt in his earlier lectures, as in the sophist text, to show the students everything that he had thought through in order so they could see through his eyes. Of course, that's in some way implausible and impossible. On the other hand, we can't help but attempt to do that. When we're dealing with this DASEIN, which has been the other comment I wanted to just make is that if it were so that the comment that I haven't been understood were just applied to a few more or less gross cases, for instance, that Jean-Paul Sartre had totally different motives than Heidegger, and therefore we can understand that what he said in many ways just has nothing to do with Heidegger. And that it's not even proper to say they're both existentialists if that were to give us the notion that we could only understand Heidegger so far as we understood Sartre and vice versa. That's not the case. So, but on the other hand, if you have cases like Spinoza and Descartes and well, you can understand Descartes without understanding Spinoza, but not the other way around. But then if you get into sort of a characterization of the rationalist tradition, then there's some efficacy to the notion that you have a... I'm taking over this idea from something I heard from the Walter Kaufmann, the translator, who said, if you have sort of tags like this, they make some sense so far as they lead us to a group of thinkers that thought together, elucidate one another. I believe this is true. Now, you can take the view that straightforwardly studying Heidegger, we should only study Heidegger, and anything else would only lead us to discredit Heidegger, such that we wouldn't accept his truth because we'd say, we'd have some kind of a genetic fallacy issue where we'd say, look at where Heidegger went wrong, and then we wouldn't really take him seriously. But on the other hand, anyone just reading Heidegger straight out isn't going to be able to understand Heidegger, so it's obvious that we have to understand all kinds of other thinkers that Heidegger understood in order to understand Heidegger. But then there's a second case, so for instance, we have to know something about Aristotle. But then there's a second, more dicey case where, what about Heidegger's real enemies? So, for instance, the so-called Frankfurt School, I think it was called the Institute of Advanced Studies or so. They had a journal, so they put out all kinds of articles already in the 30s, which basically take the view that Heidegger and people thinking in his direction, Knut Hamsun, for instance, sort of back to the land people and this kind of thing, had capitulated and abnegated the whole Western trajectory, the upward spring towards rationality. And then at the peak okay, the peak, the Frankfurt School is saying, yes, we are done with the empiricists and the rationalists. We're gone over to the critical side. We're more critical now, but we're still moving towards, you can say the highest representative of that tradition now living is Habermas. So, for instance, Habermas is still into the kind of thing Gadamer was into the, how did they call it, discourse rationality or so, trying to make discourse, make discussion into such a thing where everyone can in some way come together into the discussion and have what, as it seems to me, Heidegger would call a Reigness. So they have a situation in a discussion where something would, like Plato says, like fire leap from the ends of the branches. However, they may be populated at their tips with clumps of different ideas and different sensibilities and natural inclinations that are totally different, but nonetheless something would come over and the discourse would win out, and even if it weren't deliberation in this old Enlightenment sense of you tell me something about the truth and then I put my head down for a moment, I say but then I realize, oh, even though you've shown me out to be an ignoramus, nonetheless, I've learned something, and therefore, thank you. So maybe it's not that pretty anymore, but they're still trying at this project of, even if perhaps they don't directly admit it's about the truth per se, they admit that they say that it's about a coming together, as it were, in discourse. But it seems that they show, if you think of the Nazi edict that I've been mentioning from the book of legislation and so forth, if you think of this radical kind of nationalism that goes down to the ethnological roots, down to the, not even ethnological in any biological sense, but in this metaphysical sense of what's to the benefit of the people. And this sort of sense, you can see where it's no longer straightforwardly anything like a question of Catholic universal project. You know, Habermas and Ratzenberger, the Pope, have had a discourse. So this is still on the level of a global discourse, and the way the Institute, the way their journal articles look is what they're saying is rather there's a tendency to disavow the whole history for the sake of total irrationality. So what I want to propose just as a little formal guidepost here is we can say there's the rational and the irrational. And one may very well be able to say that Nietzsche corresponds to the irrational in some sense, although that's a long story. But the DASEIN concept proposes itself as being outside of this constellation, whereas the Frankfurt people, Adorno wrote this book long after World War II, and the relative safety of much time having passed of the but they were writing these articles in the 30s too. But he wrote this book on the so-called jargon of authenticity, attacking Heidegger, although one can say Adorno also has been accused of using much jargon, and for something like the same reason, which could be, from the citizen's point of view, you could say it could be explained by saying the terminology has to be changed because the old terminology only corresponds to the bad way of thinking of the current society. So therefore we need also new terminology, which leads to all kinds of not just technical terms, but jargon, so-called, and confusion for confusion's sake almost as we were deliberately trying to confuse ourselves in order to wrench ourselves out of the old mindset. But if you start from the Dasein concept, and you can notice immediately how it, Heidegger said Sartre's work is Dreck. When he picked it up, he said, "What is this Dreck?" Sartre's great work on being and nothingness. Um, the DASEIN concept immediately, it doesn't say something like, how does Sartre say, the existence precedes the essence, as though to say we have something, which reminds in some ways of Nietzsche, though we have the outward thing, the result, the effect in itself, and then we have to give it a meaning, a teleology, say what it's for, and so on. But Heidegger doesn't say anything like that. What he says is the only being, if that's how it should be called, that has for its essence, its existence, is Dasein. So this is something very radical and very different. And if you follow on the whole what Heidegger is saying about the position of Dasein, we can see that even this whole, even the Western tradition, which contrasts the rationality, which is connected to the things that I was mentioning before, such as Kant coming to his categorical imperative and so on, and then of course the most rational of them all being Hegel, the rational is the real. You can see how anyone, from the point of view of people like Zizek, who are still more in the Frankfurt School side, they must see everyone who doesn't take that side as an obscurantist, as a New Age obscurantist, or as in someone who is irrational, in the sense that Heidegger is still put down in, say, Harvard University as being somebody who has revivified a quote-unquote nature god, meaning that you just meaning that letting be would be understood as just delivering yourself over to the forces and cycles of nature. And surely in his later writing, Heidegger often, as I've cited before in the Why I Stay in the Provinces essay and other things, Heidegger does lend himself to being read as a back to the land type of man, as a Knut Hamsun type of nature idolater. But on the whole, this is not part of his, the core of his thinking. It's more as though it were part of his lifestyle as a peasant in the, living in a cabin out in the woods and so on. It's does not seem to correspond to the core to the core feeling of his work, like the core, let's say, the core mood of his whole thinking, and to the particular, such as what I just mentioned, that Dasein is the only being, which, if it should be called a being, that has for its existence, its essence, which is a very radically freeing term and stands very close to the thinking of the Nick this nothing, and this, and I believe that has something to do with the freedom that we want to get to, but that doesn't give us a tangible approach to it. And remembering that Heidegger, his whole life is thinking about, he's trying to come to this new beginning, as it were, and there's something intangible in Heidegger's goal, if we could call it that. And so by bringing tangibility to it doesn't mean that's the final stop, but it just means that we have a way to have an approach to this. So we'll try it in the next recording.